The champagne glass slipped from my fingers as I watched Marcus pull out Sophia's chair at our anniversary dinner. The crystal shattered against the marble floor of Le Bernardin, but the sound was nothing compared to the shattering in my chest. 12 years of marriage, and she brought her ex-boyfriend to celebrate it. My two-word response would end everything we built, but sometimes destruction is the only path to dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Manhattan. I'm James Rodriguez, a senior software engineer at a fintech startup in Soho. My days usually begin at 5:30 with coffee that's too strong and code that's never clean enough. I've spent the last 15 years building trading algorithms that move millions of dollars with keystrokes, but I've never been able to calculate the exact moment when love turns into habit. Growing up in Queens, my mother taught me that respect isn't earned through grand gestures but through consistency. Show up on time, keep your word, honor your commitments. Simple rules that built my character like lines of code building a program. My father worked double shifts at the postal service to keep us fed, and he never complained. Not once. That quiet strength became my blueprint for manhood. When I met potential clients or pitched new features to investors, I spoke in terms of reliability and measurable outcomes. No flashy promises, just solid architecture that wouldn't collapse under pressure. That approach made my career stable rather than spectacular. The startup went from 3 guys in a WeWork space to 40 employees in a real office. My equity vest schedule looked promising. My savings account grew steadily. I slept well most nights because I believed that hard work and loyalty were investments that always paid dividends. My routine felt unshakable. Gym at dawn, office by 7, home by 6 unless we were debugging a critical system. Weekends meant farmers markets in Union Square and long walks through Central Park. I read financial journals on Sunday mornings and cooked elaborate dinners on Saturday nights. It felt sustainable. It felt honest. Then Sophia walked into my carefully ordered world. I met Sophia on a rainy Thursday at a coffee shop near NYU. She was grading papers at a corner table, red pen moving with surgical precision across student essays. English literature professor, I learned later. She had this way of frowning at terrible metaphors that made me want to write better sentences. When she looked up and caught me staring, her smile was apologetic rather than flirtatious. "Sorry," she said, gesturing at the stack of papers. "Freshman composition. Some of these kids think Shakespeare invented the English language yesterday." I laughed and asked if she minded company. The coffee shop was packed, but her table had an empty chair. She pointed to it with her pen. "Be my guest. Just don't read over my shoulder unless you want to lose faith in higher education." We talked for 2 hours about everything except ourselves. She asked about the financial district, visible through the rain-streaked windows. I asked about her students, whether they still cared about books in an age of endless screens. She said literature taught empathy better than any algorithm could measure human behavior. I said algorithms at least gave you predictable outcomes. She laughed and said unpredictability was what made life interesting. When she packed up her papers, I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. "Coffee tomorrow," I suggested. "Same time if your schedule allows." She considered this with the same careful attention she gave to grading. "Same table," she said. But I picked the topic. Deal. The next day she brought a worn copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and read me a passage about love in the time of cholera. I brought my laptop and showed her how market volatility followed patterns that looked almost like poetry. Dating Sophia felt like learning a new programming language. Everything I thought I understood about communication needed translation. She spoke in metaphors and literary references. I spoke in logical frameworks and data points, but somehow we found a syntax that worked for both of us. Our differences created a kind of intellectual friction that generated warmth rather than heat. She moved into my Upper West Side apartment after 18 months of careful courtship. Her books colonized every available surface. My minimalist aesthetic adapted to accommodate first editions and course materials. She taught me to appreciate wine that cost more than $20. I taught her to appreciate the elegant simplicity of well-written code. Our friends said we balanced each other perfectly, two people who challenged each other's assumptions without trying to change each other's fundamental nature. The morning I decided to propose, I found her grading papers at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her elbow. She had this expression of intense concentration that made her look like a scholar solving ancient mysteries. That's when I knew I wanted to watch her think for the rest of my life. I bought a ring that afternoon. Simple setting, good stone, nothing flashy. The kind of choice that matched her practical elegance. I proposed on a Sunday evening in Riverside Park. The Hudson River reflected the city lights like scattered code across a dark screen. When I knelt down beside the bench where we often sat to watch the sunset, she laughed before I could say a word. "James Rodriguez," she said, "if you're about to ask me what I think you're about to ask me, the answer is yes. But I still want to hear the question." We married the following October in a small ceremony at the New York Botanical Garden. Nothing elaborate, just family and close friends surrounded by autumn leaves that looked like nature's own celebration. Sophia wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her perfectly. I wore a navy suit and a smile that felt permanent. During the reception, her father toasted us by saying we were proof that opposites could create harmony instead of chaos. Our honeymoon was a week in Tuscany, staying in a villa outside Florence where Sophia could practice her Italian and I could pretend to understand wine. We rented a small car and got lost on purpose, discovering hill towns that weren't in any guidebook. She took photographs of everything. I took photographs of her taking photographs. Back in New York, we settled into married life with the confidence of people who had found their missing piece. The first 5 years unfolded like a well-designed system. Sophia got tenure at NYU. I got promoted to lead architect. We bought a 2-bedroom co-op in the village with exposed brick walls and southern exposure. Sunday mornings meant bagels from Russ and Daughters and the Times spread across our bed. Wednesday nights meant cooking dinner together, usually something complicated that required teamwork and patience. We argued about normal things, whether to get a cat, which neighborhood to choose for our next apartment, how often to visit her parents in Connecticut versus mine in Queens. But our arguments felt productive, like debugging sessions that improved the overall system. We both understood that marriage required maintenance, regular check-ins, and careful attention to emerging problems before they became critical failures. During those early years, I caught myself smiling while doing mundane tasks, loading the dishwasher while Sophia corrected essays, picking up her dry cleaning on my way home from work. There's a peace that comes from knowing your place in someone else's story, from having routines that include another person's needs and preferences. I thought that feeling was security. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just the calm before complexity entered our code. Success in tech doesn't knock politely, it arrives in the form of acquisition offers and expansion opportunities that demand immediate decisions. Our startup got bought by a larger company, and suddenly I was managing a team of 20 engineers instead of writing code myself. The equity payout was substantial enough to change our lifestyle, but the new responsibilities meant longer hours and weekend calls with clients in different time zones. Sophia's career accelerated at the same pace. She published a paper on digital humanities that got attention from academic conferences worldwide. Speaking invitations arrived regularly.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her research required travel to archives and libraries across the country. We tried to coordinate our schedules, but modern professional life has a way of making calendar management feel like strategic warfare. Our dinner table conversations shifted from personal stories to logistical updates, flight confirmations and meeting schedules, budget discussions about the co-op renovation we'd been planning. We still kissed goodbye in the mornings and asked about each other's days, but the questions became more perfunctory, like status checks on a running system. One evening while reviewing code on my laptop during what was supposed to be our date night, Sophia closed her book with unusual force. The sound made me look up from the screen. "You know," she said, "I used to think your focus was attractive. Now I'm starting to wonder if you'd notice if I disappeared." I apologized and closed the laptop, but the comment lingered like a compiler warning I couldn't quite resolve. That was the beginning of what I now recognize as our drift phase. Neither of us intended to grow distant. We simply allowed our individual successes to create parallel tracks instead of intersecting paths. Late nights at the office became normal. Weekend work became necessary. The space between us expanded gradually, like code becoming increasingly complex until the original architecture was barely recognizable. The first real crack appeared during our 7th anniversary dinner.
I had made reservations at Daniel, her favorite restaurant, 3 weeks in advance. Then a critical bug appeared in our trading system the day before, affecting millions of dollars in transactions. I spent the afternoon in crisis mode, coordinating with the development team and communicating with increasingly anxious clients. At 6 o'clock, Sophia called to confirm I was leaving the office. 20 more minutes, I promised, knowing it was optimistic. At 7:30 she called again. Traffic's bad anyway, I said, buying time I didn't have. At 9 o'clock I was still debugging while my phone buzzed itself into exhaustion. When I finally arrived at the restaurant, they had given away our table. Sophia was standing in the lobby, coat already on, keys in her hand. The ride home was silent, except for the sound of tires on wet asphalt. In our apartment, she hung up her coat with careful precision and said, "I know your work is important, James. But I need to matter too." I started to explain about the trading system, the client obligations, the millions at risk. She held up her hand. "I don't need explanations, I need presence." We didn't fight dramatically, we barely raised our voices. But something essential shifted that night, like a load-bearing wall developing a hairline fracture. I promised to do better, and for a while I did. But promises are only as strong as the systems designed to support them, and our system was already showing signs of stress. Sophia's parents, Robert and Linda Chen, are good people wrapped in complicated family dynamics. Robert immigrated from Taiwan in the 70s and built a successful accounting practice through sheer determination and 18-hour workdays. Linda met him in graduate school at Columbia and gave up her own PhD to raise Sophia and her younger brother. They represent two different philosophies about success and sacrifice. Robert believed in visible achievements, advanced degrees, professional recognition, financial security. He measured progress in tangible metrics. Linda valued emotional intelligence and work-life balance, though she had sacrificed her own career to support Robert's ambitions. Their marriage was solid but showed the wear marks of decades spent prioritizing practical concerns over romantic gestures. Holiday dinners at their Westport home followed predictable patterns. Robert would ask about my latest projects and nod approvingly when I mentioned client acquisitions or system improvements. Linda would ask softer questions about our travel plans and whether we were happy. Sophia translated between their different languages of concern, playing interpreter for generational and cultural differences. Robert never quite warmed to me completely, though his reservations were professional rather than personal. "Software engineer," he would say, as if testing the weight of the words. "Good field. Stable. But what happens when you get older, when the technology changes faster than you can learn?" I appreciated his practical concerns, even when they felt like gentle interrogations about my long-term value proposition. Linda's worries were subtler, but more persistent. She noticed when Sophia looked tired. She asked careful questions about our date nights and weekend plans. During one visit, she pulled me aside while Robert and Sophia argued about politics in the living room. "Marriage is work," she said quietly, "but it shouldn't feel like a second job. Make sure you're investing in each other, not just your careers." My work friendships centered around people who spoke in frameworks and sprint planning. Kevin, my lead developer, could debug any system but couldn't debug his own dating life. Rachel, our product manager, organized her personal relationships with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to feature releases. We grabbed lunch together and complained about technical debt and impossible deadlines. After hours, our group chat buzzed with programming jokes and links to articles about emerging technologies. We attended meetups and conferences together, bonding over shared frustrations with legacy code and unrealistic client expectations. These relationships felt comfortable because they operated within clear boundaries and shared vocabularies. Sophia's social circle evolved around her department colleagues and the broader academic community. English professors who debated literary theory with the intensity of engineers arguing about system architecture. Graduate students who treated coffee shops like temporary offices and spent their weekends at poetry readings and book launches. When we socialized together, the conversations required constant translation. My tech friends talked about disruption and scalability. Her academic friends talked about interpretation and cultural significance. We managed these social intersections reasonably well, but they required energy and attention that sometimes felt like performance rather than relaxation. During our 8th year, Marcus Wellington entered our orbit. Initially, he appeared in Sophia's stories as a visiting professor from Oxford, brought in to teach a seminar on British Romantic poetry. "Brilliant guy," she mentioned over dinner one evening. Really understands the connection between historical context and literary innovation. I nodded and asked follow-up questions because I wanted to support her intellectual enthusiasm. Marcus had been Sophia's graduate school boyfriend at Columbia, though I learned this detail much later. They had dated seriously for 2 years before he accepted a position at Oxford, and she committed to staying in New York for her PhD. Their breakup was amicable, based on geography rather than incompatibility. Classic academic relationship casualty, she explained when the topic finally surfaced. Different continents, different career trajectories. His visiting professorship was scheduled to last 1 semester, but the department extended his contract through the spring term. Excellent teacher, Sophia reported. Students are actually reading the assignments instead of just skimming SparkNotes summaries. He brings this energy to the material that makes 19th century poetry feel contemporary and relevant. I was happy that she felt intellectually stimulated by her work environment. Academic isolation can be brutal, especially for scholars working in narrow specializations. Having a colleague who shared her research interests seemed like a professional blessing. I encouraged her to attend the lecture series he organized, and the faculty dinners that accompanied visiting scholar events. What I didn't recognize at the time was how Marcus's presence began to fill conversational spaces that had been empty between us. Sophia started coming home with stories that had more emotional texture, observations about departmental politics and student dynamics that felt more personally invested than her usual professional updates. She mentioned that Marcus had a different perspective on work-life balance than most academics. He traveled extensively during summer breaks, taught abroad, and maintained friendships across multiple continents. Someone who understood how to live fully while building a career, rather than treating career advancement as the only measure of success. These comments felt like gentle criticisms of my own approach to professional life, though Sophia never made the connections explicit. Still, I began to hear implied contrasts. Marcus made time for long lunches with colleagues while I ate sandwiches at my desk. Marcus attended cultural events during the week while I brought work home every evening. Their professional relationship evolved into a friendship that extended beyond departmental obligations. Coffee meetings to discuss curriculum development. Evening lectures followed by wine and continuation of academic debates. Weekend museum visits to see exhibitions relevant to their research interests. Sophia started staying late on campus more frequently. Faculty mixer, she would text, research collaboration session, dinner with the visiting scholars program participants, all legitimate activities that made perfect sense for someone invested in her academic community. I was debugging systems and managing client relationships, equally absorbed in my own professional obligations. The gradual shift felt natural rather than alarming. Two busy professionals adapting their social schedules to accommodate career opportunities, we still maintained our weekend routines and our anniversary traditions, though both required more intentional planning than in previous years. During our 9th year, I noticed that Sophia's energy patterns had changed. She seemed more animated when discussing work events, more engaged with departmental politics, more excited about academic conference possibilities. Her laptop stayed open later in the evenings, and her phone buzzed with text messages that made her smile in ways I didn't immediately recognize. She started mentioning Marcus more frequently in casual conversation. Observations about his teaching methods, his research insights, his perspectives on academic publishing, always in professional context but with the kind of detail that suggested deeper attention than typical collegial interest. One evening while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the bedside table. The preview showed a message from Marcus about dinner plans for the following week. Nothing inappropriate in the visible text, but seeing his name in her personal message queue created a small, uncomfortable recognition that their relationship had moved beyond purely professional boundaries. I didn't mention the message because I didn't want to seem jealous or controlling. Trust is the foundation of any strong relationship, and I trusted Sophia's judgment about her professional relationships. Academic life requires networking and collaboration. Building connections with visiting scholars was part of her job responsibilities, but I started paying closer attention to the frequency of their interactions. Text messages during dinner that made her excuse herself to respond. Weekend plans that involved departmental events I wasn't invited to attend. Evening phone calls that moved from the living room to the bedroom for privacy. None of these behaviors were definitively problematic. Graduate school friendships often maintain intimate emotional connections that blur the lines between professional and personal relationships. Academic couples understand that intellectual partnerships can create bonds that look romantic to outsiders but remain fundamentally collegial. Still, I found myself noting patterns that felt different from her interactions with other colleagues. The way she mentioned Marcus's opinions during our conversations about literature and culture, the way she dressed more carefully on days when she had meetings with the Visiting Scholars program, the way she seemed distracted during our own conversations as if part of her attention was elsewhere. Our 10th anniversary approached like a deadline requiring careful project management. I made reservations at Le Bernardin 2 months in advance, knowing that Sophia had always wanted to eat there but we had never justified the expense. I arranged to take the entire weekend off, no client calls or system maintenance. Despite the protests from my team about an upcoming product launch, I wanted our 10th anniversary to reset our relationship priorities. 10 years of marriage deserved commemoration that matched the significance of the milestone. We had survived graduate school career transitions, family illnesses, and the normal erosions that threaten any long-term partnership. This anniversary would be our recommitment ceremony, a celebration of persistence and growth. The week before our dinner, Sophia mentioned that Marcus was organizing a farewell gathering since his visiting appointment was ending. The English department was hosting a reception, followed by dinner at a restaurant in Greenwich Village. She assumed I would understand that she needed to attend these professional obligations even though they conflicted with our anniversary weekend. I suggested we could adjust our dinner reservation to accommodate her schedule. Professional relationships require maintenance, especially when colleagues are returning to different continents. We could celebrate our anniversary on Friday night instead of Saturday, or move our dinner to Sunday evening if the weekend events were more convenient for the department. Sophia agreed to the schedule modification with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the accommodation. She suggested that the anniversary dinner might be more meaningful anyway if she wasn't worrying about missing important departmental events. Academic politics are delicate, she explained. Visiting scholar relationships can impact future research opportunities and conference invitations. I appreciated her dedication to professional networking even when it required personal sacrifices. Building a successful academic career demanded strategic relationship management that often conflicted with personal preferences. I rescheduled our reservation for Friday evening and planned a weekend that would give her space for work obligations while still celebrating our marriage milestone. The night before our anniversary dinner, Sophia spent an unusual amount of time choosing her outfit. She asked my opinion about jewelry and perfume, attention to detail that reminded me of our early dating period when every occasion felt significant enough to require careful presentation. Seeing her excited about our dinner made me optimistic about reconnecting after months of parallel professional focus. Friday evening arrived with early spring weather that felt like a gift. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, the kind of night that made Manhattan feel like the most romantic city in the world. I left work early and stopped at a flower shop to buy white peonies, Sophia's favorite flowers, rare enough in March to require special ordering. At home I showered and changed into my best suit while Sophia finished her own preparation routine. She looked stunning in a black dress I didn't recognize, elegant but not overly formal, perfect for our celebration. When I handed her the flowers, she smiled with genuine surprise and pleasure. "James," she said, "these are beautiful. You remembered that I love peonies even when they're impossible to find." We took a taxi to Le Bernard, holding hands in the backseat while the city lights blurred past the windows. The restaurant's atmosphere was exactly what I had hoped for, sophisticated without being intimidating, intimate lighting that made conversation feel private and important. Our table offered a view of the dining room while providing enough separation for personal conversation. The sommelier recommended a bottle of Chablis that complemented our appetizer selections. Sophia seemed relaxed and present in a way that I hadn't experienced in months. We talked about our early relationship, remembering dates and conversations that had shaped our partnership. She laughed at my stories about learning to appreciate literature, and I teased her about her initial skepticism toward technology. During the main course, I raised my glass for a toast to 10 years of marriage. 10 years of growth, and 10 years of choosing each other despite the challenges that life had presented. Sophia clinked her glass against mine and said, "To the next 10 years, and whatever adventures they bring." The evening felt like a restoration of intimacy that had been temporarily disrupted by professional pressures. We lingered over dessert and coffee, talking about future travel plans and whether we were ready to consider starting a family. The conversation felt natural and connected, like two people remembering why they had chosen to build a life together. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Sophia excused herself to use the restroom. I signaled for the check and felt satisfied with an evening that had exceeded my expectations. Our marriage was fundamentally strong, I concluded. We had simply needed to prioritize each other above our individual career demands. When Sophia returned to the table, she was accompanied by a tall man with British accent and familiar face from the faculty photos she had shown me. Marcus Wellington, extending his hand with confident smile. James, I presume. Sophia has told me so much about you. What a coincidence running into you here tonight. Sophia's expression was carefully neutral, but I detected something that looked like mild panic behind her social smile. Actually, she said, I invited Marcus to join us for dessert, since it's his last week in New York, and this seemed like a perfect opportunity for you two to finally meet properly. The words hit me like a system crash that happens without warning, destroying hours of work in an instant. She had invited her ex-boyfriend to our 10th anniversary dinner. The romantic evening I had carefully planned and anticipated was now a three-person social event that included the visiting scholar, who had been occupying increasing amounts of her attention and energy. Marcus was already pulling out the chair that would complete our triangle, settling into our intimate celebration as if he had been expected all along. I see you've chosen the tasting menu, he said to Sophia. Excellent decision. I had the same thing last week when the department took me here for my farewell dinner.
Last week.
They had been here together last week. Our special anniversary restaurant was a place they had already shared.
Yeah.
The exclusivity and significance I had attached to this evening had been compromised before it even began. I felt like a man who had spent months planning a surprise party only to discover that the surprise was on him. The champagne glass slipped from my finger. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, and time seemed to pause while my mind processed the complete picture. Marcus reaching for his napkin to help clean up the mess, Sophia's face cycling through embarrassment, guilt, and something that looked like defiance. The other diners glancing over to assess whether the disturbance required their concern. I stood up slowly, carefully, like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on unstable ground. My hands were steady, my voice was calm, but inside something fundamental had shifted permanently. 10 years of marriage, our most important anniversary, and she had brought her ex-boyfriend to celebrate it. I looked at Sophia, then at Marcus, then back at Sophia. The silence stretched between us like a question that everyone already knew the answer to. When I finally spoke, my voice carried the weight of a decision that had just crystallized with perfect clarity. We're done. 2 words had never carried so much weight. The silence that followed stretched across the restaurant like a crack spreading through glass. Marcus froze with his napkin halfway to the broken crystal. Sophia's eyes went wide, then narrow, cycling through disbelief and anger in the span of a heartbeat. Around us, the ambient noise of Le Bernardin continued, as if the world hadn't just shifted off its axis. I remained standing, steady as the support beams I'd once calculated for building foundations. There was no tremor in my voice, no theatrical gesture to punctuate the moment. Just clarity that cut through years of accumulated doubt like clean code executing a simple command. We're done. The most complex relationship problems sometimes require the simplest solutions. Marcus cleared his throat with British politeness, as if proper etiquette could somehow repair what had just shattered. Perhaps I should give you two some privacy to discuss this, he offered, already half rising from his chair. The visiting scholar suddenly looked like what he was, an outsider who had wandered into a marriage ending and realized he was holding the match. Stay, I said without looking at him. This concerns you too. Sophia's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheekbones, the same flush she got when passionate about a literary argument, except this time the subject was our decade together and how she'd chosen to honor it. James, she started, her voice carrying that careful modulation she used when explaining complex concepts to freshman students. You're misunderstanding the situation. Marcus is leaving for Oxford on Monday. This was just a professional courtesy, an opportunity for you to meet before he returns to England. Nothing more than departmental politeness, professional courtesy. The phrase hung in the air like code that refuses to compile. I looked at her directly, noting details that suddenly seemed significant. The dress I hadn't recognized, now clearly new. The perfume that was different from her usual scent. The way she'd spent extra time with her appearance, which I'd attributed to anniversary celebration but now understood had multiple audiences. You invited your ex-boyfriend to our 10th anniversary dinner, I said, my voice carrying the same level tone I used during client presentations when emotions would only cloud the technical facts. There's no professional framework that makes that acceptable. There's no courtesy that requires celebrating our marriage with someone you used to sleep with. The words landed with the precision of debugging commands. Direct, unambiguous, final. Sophia flinched as if I'd struck her, though I hadn't moved from my position beside the table. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his academic composure finally cracking under the weight of being named explicitly rather than politely ignored. Sophia, Marcus said quietly, Perhaps we should table this conversation until later. His British understatement felt almost comical given the circumstances. Table the conversation, as if our marriage was a departmental meeting that had run over schedule and could be rescheduled for everyone's mutual convenience. Don't, I said, still looking at Sophia, don't let him speak for you. If you have something to say about why this seemed like an appropriate choice, say it yourself. Own your decision instead of hiding behind academic protocol and visiting scholar obligations. The restaurant continued its elegant dance around us. Waiters glided between tables with practiced invisibility. Couples leaned into intimate conversations over wine and carefully plated entrees. The world of functional relationships carried on while ours decomposed in real time, like a system crash that takes down only the corrupted processes while leaving the healthy ones running. Sophia's composure cracked just enough to reveal something raw underneath. You want to know why I invited Marcus? Because I was tired of celebrating our marriage alone. Because you've been present in body but absent in spirit for months. Because Marcus listens when I talk and remembers what I say and makes me feel like my thoughts matter. Her words came faster now, the controlled academic cadence giving way to something more honest and more painful. You ask about my day and check your phone while I answer. You schedule our anniversary like a business meeting and think that making reservations equals romantic effort. You've turned our marriage into a system you maintain rather than a relationship you nurture. The accusation stung because it carried enough truth to draw blood. I had been treating our relationship like a stable system that required periodic maintenance rather than ongoing attention. Work had consumed increasing amounts of my mental bandwidth, leaving less processing power for the subtle emotional algorithms that keep marriages running smoothly. But recognition of my failures didn't excuse her solution. You're right, I said. I've been distracted by work. I've taken our stability for granted. I've been a careless husband in ways that matter. None of that justifies bringing your ex-boyfriend to our anniversary dinner. None of that makes tonight acceptable. Marcus finally found his voice, though it carried less confidence than his usual James, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my relationship with Sophia. We're colleagues who share academic interests. Nothing inappropriate has occurred between us. I turned to face him directly for the first time since he'd joined our table. The British accent that Sophia found charming sounded like academic pretension when applied to You dated for 2 years in graduate school. You've been corresponding regularly since you arrived in New York. You've taken her to dinner at this same restaurant. You're sitting at our anniversary table wearing a wedding ring that doesn't belong to your wife because she's in London while you're here pursuing my wife. Each fact landed like a data point in a larger pattern that had finally become visible. Marcus's wedding ring caught the light as his hand moved nervously toward his water glass. The gold band was elegant, expensive, clearly chosen by someone with sophisticated taste. Someone who was presumably waiting for her husband to return from his academic adventure in New York. How long have you been married, Marcus? I asked with genuine curiosity. The question seemed to surprise him, as if he'd forgotten his own marriages while focusing on mine. 8 years, he answered quietly. My wife Catherine is a museum curator in London. She couldn't take leave to accompany me to New York. 8 years. His marriage was younger than mine but old enough to have weathered some storms, old enough to understand the difference between professional networking and personal betrayal. I wondered what Catherine would think of her husband's commitment to departmental courtesy if she could see him now, sitting at another couple's anniversary dinner while their marriage dissolved around him. Does Catherine know you're here tonight? I asked. Does she know you've been taking my wife to dinner and sending personal text messages and building the kind of emotional intimacy that crosses professional boundaries? Marcus's silence answered more clearly than words could have. Sophia looked between us like a student watching two professors debate a point of literary interpretation, except the text under analysis was her own choices and the consequences were measured in years rather than grades. That's what I thought, I said. So we have 2 marriages being compromised tonight instead of just one. At least Catherine has the excuse of geography. She doesn't know her husband is auditioning for a replacement position while he's supposed to be focused on visiting scholar responsibilities. The waiter approached our table with careful professionalism, clearly noting the tension but trained to handle difficult situations with minimal intrusion. Is everything satisfactory with your meal this evening? He asked, his eyes taking in the broken crystal, the untouched dessert plates, the unmistakable signs of a celebration gone wrong. We're finished, I said, pulling out my wallet. The check, please. The waiter nodded and retreated with the efficiency of someone who had witnessed other relationships end over expensive dinners and knew that discretion was part of the service. Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more force than shouting would have. "James, please, can we go home and discuss this privately, without an audience? This doesn't have to end everything between us. We can work through this if you'll give us the chance." The pronoun caught my attention. Us. Not me and you, but us. As if the relationship worth saving included 3 people instead of 2. As if Marcus had somehow become a stakeholder in our marriage who deserved consideration in our conflict resolution process. "There is no us anymore," I said. "There's you and your choices, and there's me and mine. You chose to share our anniversary with your ex-boyfriend. I'm choosing to end our marriage rather than negotiate with that decision." The finality of my words settled over the table like code that had finally compiled successfully after hours of debugging. Clean, logical, irreversible. Sophia's eyes filled with tears that didn't quite fall, held back by pride or shock or the public setting that required emotional composure. Marcus stood abruptly, as if sudden movement could somehow extract him from the consequences of his presence. "I should go," he announced to no one in particular. "This is clearly a private matter that doesn't require my involvement." His academic training had apparently included protocols for graceful exits from academic controversies but not from marriage explosions. "You should have thought of that before you accepted the invitation," I said without moving to block his departure. "You should have thought of that before you spent 3 months building an emotional relationship with a married woman. You should have thought of that before you forgot your own wedding ring meant something." He paused at my words, his face cycling through emotions that looked like guilt, defensiveness, and something that might have been regret. Then he turned and walked away with the measured pace of someone who was trying not to appear to be fleeing but definitely wanted to be anywhere else. The waiter returned with the check and a small container for the broken crystal, clearly practiced in cleaning up the debris of failed celebrations. I signed the receipt and added a generous tip because none of this was his fault and service workers shouldn't suffer for their customers' personal catastrophes. Sophia sat motionless, staring at her untouched dessert as if it contained answers to questions she was afraid to ask. The restaurant's ambient lighting cast shadows across her face that made her look older, more tired, like someone who had just realized that actions have consequences that can't be undone by explanation or apology. The taxi ride home was silent except for the sound of tires on wet pavement and the occasional ping of my phone receiving messages I didn't check. Sophia stared out her window at the city lights blurring past, her reflection superimposed over the Manhattan streetscape like a ghost haunting her own life. Back in our apartment, the familiar space felt different, charged with the electricity of change that makes furniture look temporary and shared possessions seem like evidence of a relationship that had already ended. Sophia went directly to the bathroom and closed the door, running water that couldn't wash away what had happened at dinner. I sat in the living room surrounded by books and photographs and 10 years of accumulated memories that would need to be sorted, divided, or discarded. The wedding photo on the mantel showed 2 people who looked impossibly young and optimistic, as if they'd never considered that love might not be enough to sustain a marriage through the complexities of adult life. When Sophia emerged from the bathroom, she had changed into pajamas and removed her makeup, stripping away the evening's careful presentation to reveal something more vulnerable and more honest. She sat on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining the physical distance that had somehow become our default arrangement over the past year. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said, her voice steady but careful, like someone testing the structural integrity of a bridge before crossing. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But 10 years of marriage deserves more than a 2-word ending in a public restaurant." I looked at her across the space that had once been our shared refuge from the world. The woman I'd promised to love through better and worse, richer and poorer, sickness and health. The promises had been easier to make than to keep, apparently for both of us, though our failures had taken different forms. "You're right," I said. 10 years deserves more than 2 words. It deserves honesty about what we've become and what we're not willing to accept. So let me be clear about where I stand. You invited your ex-boyfriend to our anniversary dinner. That's not a mistake or a misunderstanding. That's a choice that tells me everything I need to know about how you value our marriage. She started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I wasn't finished processing the logic that would determine our next steps. "You've been building an emotional relationship with Marcus for months. Text messages, Dinners, personal conversations that you've kept separate from our marriage. You've been investing in another relationship while withdrawing from ours. The words came easier now, like explaining a technical problem to a client who needed to understand the severity before they could accept the solution. You haven't technically cheated, but you've created the conditions where cheating becomes inevitable. You've been preparing for a different life while pretending to maintain this one. Sophia's composure finally cracked completely. The tears that had been threatening all evening finally fell, streaking down her face with the kind of rawness that can't be faked or performed. You think I planned this? You think I wanted our marriage to fall apart? You think I enjoyed watching you disappear into your work while I felt increasingly irrelevant in my own relationship? Her pain was real, but pain doesn't excuse betrayal any more than explanation excuses consequences. I understand that you felt neglected, I said. I understand that I've been a distracted husband who prioritized work over relationship maintenance. I accept responsibility for creating conditions that made you vulnerable to outside attention. But understanding your motivation doesn't change the fact that you chose Marcus instead of choosing to fight for us. You chose to build something new rather than repair what we had. You chose to bring him into our anniversary instead of demanding my full attention for our relationship. The silence that followed was different from the restaurant silence. This was the quiet of two people finally seeing their relationship clearly, without the softening filters of hope or denial or wishful thinking. The apartment felt like a museum of a marriage that had already ended, filled with artifacts from a life we would no longer share. Sophia wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded me of the graduate student I'd fallen in love with in that coffee shop years ago. But the woman sitting across from me now was a stranger who had made choices that the younger version never would have considered. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "How do I fix this? How do we move forward from here?" The questions hung in the air like code waiting for input, but some problems don't have solutions that preserve the original system. "I want you to be honest about what you want," I said. "Do you want to repair our marriage, or do you want to pursue whatever you've been building with Marcus? Do you want to recommit to us, or do you want permission to explore what else might be possible?" Her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. A woman fighting for her marriage doesn't need time to consider whether she wants to save it. A woman who is genuinely committed to one relationship doesn't struggle to choose between two men. "I think," she said slowly, carefully, like someone working through a complex literary analysis, "I think I need time to figure out what I want. I think I've been confused for months about what I need and what makes me happy. I think Marcus has shown me possibilities I'd forgotten existed." Her honesty was brutal and clarifying. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or promising to end her relationship with Marcus. She was asking for permission to explore her options while keeping our marriage as a safety net. She wanted time to audition for a different life while maintaining the security of our shared one. "Thank you for being honest," I said. "That makes my decision easier." I stood up from the couch with the same measured movement I'd used at the restaurant. Decisive but not dramatic. Final but not cruel. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow I'll find a lawyer and start the process of ending our marriage. You can have time to figure out what you want, but you'll do it as a single woman rather than as my wife who's exploring other options." Sophia's face went through the same cycle of emotions I'd seen at the restaurant. Disbelief that I was actually following through on consequences rather than negotiating or compromising. Anger that I wasn't willing to fight for a relationship she'd already abandoned in everything but legal status. Fear about what her life would look like without the stability our marriage had provided. "James, wait. Please, can't we try counseling? Can't we take some time to work through this without immediately jumping to divorce? Can't we at least try to save what we built together?" Her questions revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had led us to this moment. She thought our marriage was something that could be paused while she explored alternatives, then resumed if the other options didn't work out. She thought love was a resource that could be divided between multiple relationships without diminishing any of them. "You can't save something you've already discarded," I said. "You can't repair a relationship while you're actively building a different one. You can't ask me to wait while you decide whether I'm worth choosing when you've already shown me that I'm not." The guest room felt smaller than I remembered, furnished with pieces we designated as temporary when we first moved into the apartment. The bed was narrow and firm, designed for occasional use rather than extended occupation. It would be my space for however long it took to arrange more permanent living situations. Through the thin wall I could hear Sophia moving around the bedroom we'd shared for years, drawers opening and closing, the sound of someone trying to process change through physical activity. Later I heard her on the phone, her voice too low to make out words but the rhythm suggesting someone seeking advice or comfort from a friend. I didn't try to listen. Whatever she needed to say about our situation, whoever she needed to call for support or guidance, those conversations were no longer my concern. My responsibility was to my own next steps, my own healing process, my own transition from married to single. Sleep came surprisingly easily, like the rest that follows completion of a difficult project. I'd made a decision that aligned with my values and self-respect. The outcome was painful, but the process had been clear and logical. I'd drawn a boundary and committed to enforcing it regardless of the emotional cost. The next morning brought clarity that felt almost mathematical in its precision. While Sophia slept, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, researching divorce attorneys and reading articles about asset division in New York State. The legal framework for ending a marriage turned out to be simpler than the emotional one. I called in sick to work, something I'd done perhaps 3 times in 15 years of professional life. Kevin, my lead developer, assured me that the team could handle any emergencies that arose. Rachel, our product manager, told me to take whatever time I needed and not to worry about client relationships until I was ready to focus on them. The response from my colleagues reminded me that life continues even when individual relationships end. Systems adapt to accommodate changed conditions, teams redistribute responsibilities to maintain functionality. The world doesn't stop because one marriage fails. By 10 o'clock I had appointments scheduled with 3 different attorneys for the following week. By noon I had researched temporary housing options and identified several furnished apartments available for short-term lease. By evening I had outlined a plan for separating our shared life into 2 independent ones. Sophia emerged from the bedroom around 2 in the afternoon, looking like someone who had spent the night processing rather than sleeping. She moved through the apartment carefully, as if our shared space had become fragile and might break under normal use. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table, "about not being able to save something that's already been discarded. I want you to know that I never intended to discard our marriage. I was trying to find a way to feel alive again while staying committed to what we built together." Her explanation had the careful structure of someone who had been rehearsing it, working through arguments and counter-arguments in preparation for a conversation that might determine the rest of her life. But preparation couldn't change the fundamental facts that had led us to this point. "Intention doesn't matter as much as impact," I replied. "You intended to maintain our marriage while exploring emotional intimacy with Marcus. The impact was that I felt betrayed and replaced. You intended to celebrate our anniversary while including him in the celebration. The impact was that our most important milestone became about someone else." She absorbed this like a student receiving feedback on a failed assignment, recognizing the logic but struggling to accept the consequences. "But people make mistakes, James. People get confused and make poor choices and deserve the opportunity to correct them. Doesn't 10 years of marriage earn some tolerance for human error?" The question was reasonable, and in different circumstances it might have led to a different outcome. Marriage does require forgiveness for mistakes, patience during difficult periods, and commitment that survives temporary failures of judgment. "But this wasn't a mistake," I said. "This was a pattern of choices over several months. This was a deliberate cultivation of emotional intimacy with another man, while withdrawing from intimacy with me. This was bringing him to our anniversary dinner because you wanted him there more than you wanted to protect our celebration." Each point landed with the precision of code that had been tested and verified. Sophia couldn't argue with the logic because the logic was based on her own actions, documented and undeniable. She could explain her motivations, but explanation couldn't change the impact of her choices. The afternoon dissolved into practical conversations about immediate logistics, who would stay in the apartment temporarily while we sorted out long-term arrangements, how to handle shared credit cards and joint bank accounts, which belongings were clearly individual versus mutually acquired. These discussions felt like project management meetings, focused on deliverables and timelines rather than emotions and regrets. We were both more comfortable with logistics than with feelings, and practical planning provided structure during a period when everything else felt chaotic and uncertain. By evening we had established a temporary framework that would allow both of us to function while the legal process unfolded. Sophia would remain in the apartment through the end of the semester, giving her time to finish her teaching obligations and figure out her next steps. I would move to a furnished apartment in Brooklyn, close enough to maintain my work routine but far enough to establish genuine separation. The conversation was civil, even cooperative, like two professionals managing a difficult project transition. We avoided blame and recrimination, focusing instead on practical solutions that would minimize disruption to our individual lives while acknowledging that our shared life was ending. That night, for the second time, I slept in the guest room while Sophia occupied our former bedroom. The arrangement felt less temporary than it had the previous evening, more like a preview of the permanent separation that was coming. The apartment was quiet except for the usual sounds of city life filtering through windows that had once framed our shared view of the world. Sunday morning, I packed a suitcase with enough belongings to sustain me for several weeks. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, and a few books that felt essential for maintaining some sense of continuity during the transition. The process was surprisingly straightforward, like preparing for a business trip except that the return date was indefinite. Sophia watched from the doorway as I folded shirts and gathered charging cables, her expression cycling between sadness and something that looked like relief. The end of our marriage was painful, but it was also the resolution of months of tension and uncertainty that had made our shared space feel increasingly uncomfortable. As I prepared to leave for what might be the last time as a resident rather than a visitor, she asked the question that had been hovering between us since Friday night. Do you think there's any chance we could work through this? Any possibility that time and counseling and commitment might allow us to rebuild what we had? Her question deserved an honest answer, even though honesty would foreclose possibilities rather than preserve them. I turned to face her directly, seeing the woman I'd loved for more than a decade and chosen to marry on that optimistic October afternoon when forever seemed achievable. I think you're going to pursue whatever you've been building with Marcus, I said. I think the excitement you feel about him is more compelling than the work required to repair what we had. I think you've already made your choice, even if you're not ready to admit it to yourself yet. She started to protest, but I continued before she could mount a defense that we both knew would be based more on hope than evidence, and I think that's probably the right choice for you. You deserve to feel alive and appreciated and intellectually stimulated. You deserve a relationship that energizes you rather than one that feels like maintenance work. The words were harder to say than I'd expected, but they carried the weight of truth that had been building for months. Our marriage had become functional rather than fulfilling, stable rather than exciting. We had both been settling for compatibility rather than demanding passion, but I also deserve a partner who chooses me clearly and completely, I added. I deserve someone who doesn't need to explore other options to appreciate what we have together. I deserve a relationship that feels like a priority rather than a safety net. My suitcase was packed, my temporary apartment was waiting. The practical arrangements for our separation were in place. All that remained was the final transition from married to single, from shared life to individual ones. At the door, Sophia asked if she could hug me goodbye. The request was simple, almost childlike in its directness. I considered the question carefully, weighing kindness against clarity, sentiment against self-protection. I think that would make this harder for both of us, I said. I think clean breaks heal better than gradual ones. I think we should start practicing separation now rather than prolonging contact that's going to end anyway. She nodded with understanding that looked like acceptance mixed with disappointment. The woman who had once shared my bed and my dreams was becoming a person I was learning to release with respect rather than bitterness. I took the elevator down to the lobby for what felt like the last time as a resident of the building where we'd planned to grow old together. The doorman who'd watched us carry groceries and furniture and hopes up to our apartment for years wished me a good day with the same professional courtesy he'd always shown. Outside, Manhattan hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their individual versions of happiness and success. Couples walked hand in hand toward brunches and museums and shared adventures. Families navigated sidewalks with strollers and dogs in the comfortable chaos of Sunday morning routines. I stood on the corner for a moment, suitcase in hand, watching the city continue its eternal dance of connection and separation, commitment and change. Somewhere in this urban maze, other marriages were ending while new relationships began. Other people were choosing dignity over compromise, self-respect over security. The taxi ride to Brooklyn felt like traveling between two different versions of my life. Behind me, the shared apartment where I'd learned to be a husband. Ahead of me, a furnished studio where I'd remember how to be myself without reference to someone else's needs and preferences. The apartment was small but clean, efficiently designed for temporary residents who needed functionality rather than personality. One room that served as bedroom, living room and office. A kitchen with basic appliances and minimal storage. A bathroom with shower, sink and mirror that would reflect only my own face for however long it took to rebuild my life. I unpacked methodically, hanging clothes in the narrow closet and arranging toiletries in the medicine cabinet. Each item found its place in this temporary space that would serve as home base while I figured out what permanent looked like for a newly single 42-year-old man. By evening I had established a basic routine in my new environment. Coffee in the morning at the cafe downstairs, work schedule maintained from the apartment when possible, gym membership transferred to a location near my temporary address. The practical elements of single life were straightforward enough to implement immediately. What would take longer was the emotional recalibration required to think in singular pronouns again, to make decisions based only on my own preferences, to plan weekends and vacations and grocery shopping without considering another person's needs or schedules. That night, in a bed that was mine alone for the first time in more than a decade, I slept with the profound exhaustion that follows major life transitions. The kind of sleep that comes when your body finally stops fighting change and accepts that adaptation is the only option. Monday morning brought the return to normal work routines that provided structure during a period when everything else felt uncertain. Kevin and Rachel were supportive but respectful, offering assistance without pressing for details about my personal situation. The team adapted to my temporary remote work arrangement without missing deadlines or compromising client relationships. Professional life continued with remarkable stability despite the chaos in my personal sphere. Code still needed to be written and debugged. Client meetings still required preparation and follow-through. The systems I'd built over years of careful work continued to function regardless of my marital status. That consistency was both comforting and sobering. It reminded me that individual relationships, however significant, are ultimately just components in larger systems that continue operating when specific elements fail or change. Life continues, work continues, the world continues. Tuesday brought my first consultation with a divorce attorney, a woman in her 50s, who'd handled hundreds of marriage dissolutions with the professional competence that comes from experience with human nature at its most vulnerable. She reviewed my situation with practiced efficiency, outlining timelines and procedures with the same matter-of-fact approach I used when explaining technical systems to non-technical clients. No children, no complicated business arrangements, no significant debt or unusual assets. Relatively straightforward case, she assured me, especially if both parties remained cooperative rather than adversarial. 6 months to a year for complete resolution depending on how quickly we could reach agreement on property division and support arrangements. The legal framework for ending a marriage turned out to be simpler than the emotional one, just as I'd suspected. Forms to file, waiting periods to observe, financial statements to prepare. Bureaucratic processes designed to transform intimate partnerships into civil contracts that could be terminated through proper procedure. Wednesday evening brought a text message from Sophia that I'd been expecting but wasn't prepared to receive. We need to talk about next steps. Can we meet for coffee this weekend to discuss practical arrangements? Her tone was careful, professional, like a colleague proposing a business meeting rather than an ex-wife requesting conversation with her former husband. I agreed to meet Saturday afternoon at a neutral location, a cafe in Midtown that neither of us had visited during our marriage. Neutral ground for a conversation that would need to balance personal history with practical necessity, shared past with separate futures. The rest of the week passed in a blur of routine activities that felt simultaneously familiar and strange. Work meetings that proceeded normally despite my changed personal circumstances. Gym sessions that provided physical relief from emotional stress. Dinners eaten alone while reading books or watching television shows that didn't require shared attention or commentary. By Friday evening, I had established a preliminary rhythm for single life that felt sustainable if not particularly exciting. Early bedtime, early rising, productive workdays. Exercise that cleared my head rather than just maintaining physical fitness. Social contact limited to professional relationships and family check-ins. Saturday afternoon, I arrived at the designated cafe 10 minutes early, choosing a table that offered privacy without seeming secretive. Sophia appeared exactly on time, dressed in casual clothes that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had during our formal anniversary dinner conversation. We ordered coffee and settled into the careful politeness that former intimate partners use when they're no longer sure how to relate to each other. The woman sitting across from me was both familiar and foreign, someone whose expressions and gestures I knew by heart but whose thoughts and motivations had become mysterious. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, stirring sugar into her latte with unnecessary attention to the process. About choosing clearly and completely. About not being able to repair a relationship while building a different one. I think you're right about that. Her admission carried the weight of recognition rather than apology. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or proposing reconciliation, she was acknowledging the accuracy of my analysis and accepting the consequences that followed logically from her choices. I've also been thinking about Marcus, she continued, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. About what I want and what's realistic and what kind of life would actually make me happy. I think I need to find out whether what I feel for him is real or just the excitement of something new and forbidden. Her honesty was both painful and clarifying. She was confirming what I'd suspected since our anniversary dinner, that her relationship with Marcus had progressed beyond professional courtesy into emotional territory that excluded me. She was also confirming that ending our marriage was the right choice for both of us. Thank you for being direct, I said. That helps me understand where we stand and how to proceed. Are you planning to pursue a relationship with Marcus once our marriage is officially ended? She hesitated, clearly weighing honesty against the potential pain her answer might cause. I think so, she said finally. I think I need to explore what's possible with him without the complication of being married to someone else. I think I owe it to myself to find out whether this feeling is worth the cost of our marriage. Her calculation was brutal but logical. She was treating our decade together as a sunk cost, an investment that hadn't yielded the return she wanted and therefore should be abandoned in favor of potentially more profitable opportunities. The business metaphor was harsh but accurate. I understand, I said, and meant it. The clarity was helpful even when the content was painful. She had made her choice, and I could make mine accordingly. No point in negotiating or pleading or trying to compete with someone who offered different advantages than I could provide. We spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements with the efficiency of project managers wrapping up a failed initiative, timeline for moving her belongings out of our shared apartment, division of furniture and household items, cancellation of joint accounts and subscriptions. The conversation was civil, even cooperative, focused on logistics rather than emotions. We both understood that successful separation required clear boundaries and minimal ongoing contact. Clean breaks heal better than prolonged entanglements, even when the breaking process is painful. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Sophia asked one final question that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised me. Do you hate me? She asked quietly. For choosing this way? For ending what we had? The question deserved careful consideration. Hate was too simple an emotion for the complexity of what I felt about our marriage's end. Disappointment, certainly. Sadness about opportunities lost and time wasted. Anger about the way she'd chosen to handle her dissatisfaction, but not hate. I don't hate you, I said. I'm disappointed in the choices you made, but I understand why you made them. I'm sad that we couldn't find a way to grow together instead of apart, but I accept that sometimes people want different things even when they started from the same place. Her relief was visible, as if my forgiveness could somehow absolve her of the consequences of her decisions. But forgiveness doesn't change outcomes, and understanding motivations doesn't eliminate the need for boundaries. I hope you find what you're looking for with Marcus, I added. I hope the excitement you feel about him develops into something lasting and fulfilling. I hope you're happier in your next relationship than you were in the final years of ours. The words were harder to say than I'd expected, but they carried the weight of genuine well-wishing rather than bitter sarcasm. Despite everything, I wanted Sophia to be happy. I just couldn't be the person responsible for creating that happiness. We parted ways on the sidewalk outside the cafe, two people who had once planned to grow old together now heading in different directions towards separate futures. The finality felt both devastating and liberating, like the end of a long illness that had been draining energy from other aspects of life. The subway ride back to Brooklyn gave me time to process what had just occurred. Our marriage was officially ending, not with dramatic confrontation but with practical negotiation. Sophia was choosing Marcus, and I was choosing self-respect. Both decisions felt inevitable given the circumstances that had led us to this point. That evening, alone in my temporary apartment, I felt something that surprised me. Relief. The uncertainty that had been poisoning our relationship for months was finally resolved. The tension between what we'd been and what we were becoming had finally been acknowledged and addressed. I was 42 years old, single for the first time in over a decade, facing a future that contained no predetermined outcomes or guaranteed companionship. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff that offered both danger and possibility. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after major decisions have been made and accepted. I woke without an alarm for the first time in months. My body finally relaxed enough to trust its own rhythms instead of running on external schedules and obligations. The Brooklyn apartment felt more like home with each passing day. Small improvements made the space mine rather than just temporary shelter. A coffee maker that brewed exactly the strength I preferred. Books arranged on shelves according to my own system rather than compromise aesthetics. The freedom to eat breakfast at the counter without considering someone else's morning routine. 2 months later, the divorce papers arrived by certified mail, official documents that transformed our decade together into legal language about asset division and mutual release from marital obligations. I signed them in the presence of a notary who had witnessed thousands of similar endings, her expression professionally neutral about what the papers represented. The finality was both sobering and liberating. James Rodriguez, divorced, a new category of existence that required different approaches to social situations, tax filing and weekend planning. But also a category that offered possibilities I hadn't considered since my 20s, when the future felt entirely unwritten. Kevin mentioned seeing Sophia at a faculty event in Manhattan, walking hand in hand with a tall man who spoke with a British accent. The information was delivered carefully, without editorial comment, just data that Kevin thought I might want to process. I thanked him for the update and felt nothing except mild curiosity about whether she'd found what she was looking for. My attorney called that afternoon to confirm that all paperwork had been processed correctly. The marriage was officially dissolved as of that morning, property division complete. No outstanding obligations. Clean break achieved with remarkable efficiency given the emotional complexity that had led to this outcome. Rachel suggested celebrating with drinks after work, a small acknowledgement that endings deserve recognition even when they're painful. We went to a bar near the office where conversations about code architecture and client relationships provided comfortable distraction from personal transitions. That evening, alone in my apartment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the deep relief that comes when a difficult situation has been resolved rather than prolonged. The uncertainty that had poisoned the final months of my marriage was gone, replaced by clarity about who I was and what I wanted. I started cooking again, elaborate weekend meals that served only me but satisfied something essential about creating rather than just consuming. Saturday farmers market visits became explorations of ingredients I'd never tried, experiments with flavors that didn't require negotiation or compromise. The gym became a place for rebuilding physical strength that mirrored emotional reconstruction, longer runs that cleared my head. Weight training that reminded me of capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. The methodical process of becoming stronger, one workout at a time. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I moved from the temporary Brooklyn apartment to a permanent place in Queens, close enough to visit my parents regularly, far enough from Manhattan to feel like genuine fresh start. 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping, and one for the home office that let me work remotely when concentration required quiet. The new neighborhood had tree-lined streets and families who'd lived there for generations. Corner stores where the owners remembered your usual order. A barber who told stories about the area's history while trimming hair with old-school precision. The kind of community stability I'd forgotten was possible in New York. Kevin and I launched a consulting company 6 months later, building on relationships we'd developed during years of client work. The freedom to choose projects based on interest rather than just revenue changed how I approached professional challenges. Code became creative expression again instead of just problem solving for other people's visions. Our first independent project was a trading platform for a renewable energy company, algorithms that optimized wind and solar investments instead of just maximizing short-term profits. Work that felt aligned with values I'd rediscovered during the process of rebuilding my life from scratch. A year after the divorce, I met Elena at a tech meetup in Long Island City. Software architect like me, but focused on healthcare systems instead of financial ones. She had the kind of quick intelligence that could debug complex problems and the kind of laugh that made ordinary conversations feel significant. We talked for 3 hours about database optimization and terrible project managers finding common ground in shared experiences with dysfunctional development teams and impossible deadlines. When she asked if I wanted to continue the conversation over dinner, I realized I was ready to consider the possibility of letting someone new into the life I'd been rebuilding. Our first date was pizza in Astoria, followed by a walk along the East River, Manhattan skyline reflecting in water that looked almost clean in the evening light. She told stories about her family's immigration from Guatemala and her determination to build systems that helped rather than exploited vulnerable populations. I told her about my marriage ending and my process of learning to be single again, the careful reconstruction of identity that happens when you stop defining yourself in relation to someone else. She listened without trying to fix or analyze, just receiving information about who I was and how I'd arrived at this point. Elena moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd survived difficult transitions and emerged stronger. Divorced once herself, mother to a teenage daughter who split time between households with remarkable adaptability, she understood the difference between being ready for relationship and being desperate for one. We dated slowly, carefully, like people who'd learned that foundations matter more than excitement. Coffee meetings that stretched into afternoon walks, dinners that ended with conversation instead of assumptions about next steps. The patient process of getting to know someone without rushing toward predetermined outcomes. She met my parents after 3 months, fitting easily into family dynamics that had always been straightforward rather than complicated. My mother appreciated Elena's directness and her stories about teaching her daughter to code. My father respected her professional accomplishments and her practical approach to single parenthood. I met her daughter Carmen after 4 months, a 15-year-old who assessed new adults in her mother's life with the skepticism that comes from experience with parental dating. She asked direct questions about my intentions and my understanding of how complicated family structures work when multiple households are involved. Carmen and I bonded over shared appreciation for elegant code and terrible science fiction movies, finding common ground that didn't require me to pretend to be a replacement father figure. Just another adult who cared about her mother and understood that teenagers deserve respect rather than attempted friendship from their parents' romantic partners. Elena and I moved in together after 18 months of careful courtship, combining households with the patience of people who'd learned that merging lives requires attention to detail and respect for individual needs. Her books found places next to mine, my kitchen equipment supplemented hers. We created shared space without erasing individual identity. Carmen adjusted to the new arrangement with the flexibility that teenagers develop when they've navigated multiple family configurations. She claimed the spare bedroom for weekend visits and established homework routines that worked around our professional schedules. 2 years after meeting Elena, I proposed during a weekend trip to Maine, walking along a beach where the Atlantic stretched toward horizons that felt full of possibility rather than limitation. She said yes with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing someone thoroughly rather than being swept away by romantic fantasy. We married the following spring in a small ceremony in Central Park, surrounded by family and close friends who had watched us build something solid and sustainable rather than dramatic. Carmen served as maid of honor, standing beside her mother with pride in their shared resilience and optimism about their expanding family unit. Our honeymoon was a week in Costa Rica, exploring rainforests and beaches while Elena practiced Spanish with locals and I marveled at biodiversity that reminded me how much world existed beyond the constraints of previous limitations. We returned home ready to continue building a life based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. The consulting company Kevin and I started now employs 12 people, working on projects that combine technical excellence with social impact. Elena joined us part-time, bringing healthcare expertise that expanded our client base into medical technology and public health systems. Carmen graduated high school and chose computer science at NYU, following a path that honored both her mother's influence and her own interests in artificial intelligence and machine learning. She visits our Queens house regularly, treating it as home base while maintaining independence appropriate to young adulthood. 5 years after my divorce was finalized, I can honestly say that ending my marriage with Sophia was the most difficult and most necessary decision I'd ever made. The pain of that failure taught me the difference between settling for compatibility and insisting on genuine partnership. Elena and I argue sometimes, usually about technical approaches to complex problems or the best way to handle Carmen's college expenses. But our arguments feel productive rather than destructive, debugging sessions that improve our overall system rather than threatening its stability. We maintain individual interests and friendships while building shared goals and routines. I still cook elaborate weekend meals, but now they serve 2 adults and occasionally 1 teenager who appreciates good food and interesting conversation. Elena still reads mystery novels before bed, but now she summarizes plots for someone who enjoys her analysis of character motivation and narrative structure. The apartment we share in Queens has become home in ways that the Manhattan place never quite achieved. Familiar rhythms and established traditions, neighbors who know our names and ask about Carmen's college progress. The deep satisfaction that comes from building something sustainable rather than just exciting. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Sophia and Marcus, whether their relationship survived the transition from forbidden attraction to daily reality. But the curiosity is mild, like wondering about characters from a book I read years ago rather than people who once shared my most intimate spaces. The last time I saw Sophia was at a coffee shop in Midtown 18 months after our divorce was finalized. She looked happy but older, wearing an engagement ring that wasn't the one I'd given her. We exchanged polite greetings and brief updates about professional developments. The conversation felt like talking to a distant acquaintance rather than someone who had once shared my bed in my dreams. She mentioned that Marcus had returned to Oxford permanently and that she was considering a job offer at a university in London. Following him across an ocean the way she hadn't been willing to fight for our marriage, the irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't generate anger or satisfaction. Just recognition that people make different choices at different times based on different priorities. That evening I told Elena about the encounter without jealousy or regret, just as information about my past that had intersected briefly with my present. She listened with the same calm attention she brought to debugging complex systems, processing data without emotional reaction to facts that couldn't be changed. Now, sitting in my home office on a quiet Sunday morning, I can see the choices that led from that devastating anniversary dinner to this peaceful moment. Each decision had seemed impossible at the time but had accumulated into a life that feels authentic rather than compromise. The 2 words I spoke at Le Bernardin changed everything that followed, not because they were dramatic or clever, but because they represented a boundary I was finally ready to enforce. Sometimes the most important conversations are the shortest ones. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve. Elena is in the kitchen making coffee, Carmen is visiting friends before returning to campus, and I have consulting work that challenges rather than frustrates me. Small satisfactions that add up to contentment rather than excitement, but contentment that feels sustainable rather than fragile. The man who dropped his wedding ring 5 years ago couldn't have imagined this outcome. He was too focused on what he was losing to envision what he might gain. Too committed to preserving something broken to consider the possibility of building something new. But sometimes destruction is the only path to construction. Sometimes you have to end one story completely before you can begin writing a better one. Sometimes 2 words are enough to change everything that follows. We're done. The most important sentence I ever spoke because it made space for everything that came after. Including this morning, this coffee, this quiet satisfaction that comes from choosing dignity over convenience, self-respect over security, possibility over the known disappointment of settling for less than love deserves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.